Capcom's Hideaki Itsuno, the man responsible for Power Stone, Devil May Cry and Dragon's Dogma as well as many more, has left Capcom after more than 3 decades for pastures new. Just last month we heard that Davide Soliani was also headed for the hills after quitting Ubisoft, while at the end of last year we heard the news that Hideki Kamiya has left Platinum Games. Now look, this is a Nintendo-focused channel primarily. Frankly, my playtime is almost exclusively first-party Nintendo content, and I rarely pay much attention to the rest of the industry. But we seem to be in an era of hugely talented, iconic directors now striking out on their own. What is going on? Is there a common thread? What does it mean for the industry? And does Nintendo have the ability or even the interest to capitalize on these major changes? Settle in as we look at the age of the freelance video game auteurs. The concept of the auteur grew out of French cinema in the 1940s, but the concept did not remain there. Time was even in money-hungry Hollywood, major names, the Kubricks and Spielbergs, could command attention to even works with no existing franchise behind them. These days, it's the rare director whose name alone would be enough to draw in mass audiences, and those who can are usually long in the tooth. Even Christopher Nolan is the wrong side of 50. In the field of comic books, Marvel and DC retain a huge stranglehold on the industry, and while the upstart creator-owned publisher Image Comics has pushed itself into third place generally, it is chiefly on the strength of a handful of outsized successes such as The Walking Dead. And so to games, where Nintendo's lineup is almost exclusively reiterations of existing franchises, with the occasional game trying something different. Some companies try to innovate more than others. All credit to Square Enix for trying innovative new titles like Octopath Traveler and Triangle Strategy in recent years. But it is still the rare video game creator who can bootstrap something original through sheer force of personality. And arguably, they don't need to. Games are not like films. With a film, using an existing set of characters instantly limits you. Audiences have narrative expectations, and you have to consider whether the film makes sense not just in its own right, but in coordination with the others. The complexity of the project instantly grows, as does the margin for error. But games are fundamentally about play mechanics. Shigeru Miyamoto has said that they were lucky that Mario was kept relatively nondescript when they created him, because it gave them the latitude to plug him into lots of different game genres. Splatoon could easily have been a Mario spin-off, but they decided something different would fit the game mechanic they had chosen that much better. Genius creatives like Masahiro Sakurai, Yoshio Sakamoto, or even Shigeru Miyamoto do not need to start from scratch in terms of the character set, even if they can be very innovative in terms of the play styles they develop for those characters. Which brings us back to some of the recent directors who have left comfortable, long-standing posts at famous companies to strike out elsewhere. Now look, it's not uncommon for people to leave jobs, and even in Japan, where company loyalty is much greater, Nintendo is incredibly unusual for its very low attrition rate. And this kind of thing certainly doesn't always have a happy ending. Sonic the Hedgehog creator Yuji Naka joining Square Enix started as the chance for him to flex his genius muscles, and ended with Balan Wonderworld and a prison sentence. However, is there anything particularly happening now that is causing a rash of fairly big names to jump ship from the companies they're most closely associated with? We first need to establish why these people have left, and of course in certain respects the information is not entirely clear. When leaving a company, it is generally poor form to let rip into them, and so any concerns that may have triggered these exits are likely not to be aired for a long time if ever, if these creatives still wish to work in the industry, which is going to be reliant on connections. In the case of Hideaki Itsuno, we know from an interview with Ruben Langdon, the English voice of Devil May Cry's Dante, that the man was not completely happy. He was quoted in a podcast as saying back in 2014, he was ready to leave Capcom. He was not happy, and I think he even put in his resignation. Capcom compromised by giving him the ability to make his games in his wish list. Allegedly, said Langdon, he said, "I'll stay if you give me Devil May Cry and let me do it the way I want to do it." Now that was 10 years ago, so Capcom may well have changed since then, but if he was considering leaving over creative restraints then, it's reasonable to imagine that he's stepping away from them now for a similar reason. After all, in theory, for a keen game developer, being an admired director at a major and successful Japanese studio is pretty much the best place to be, not a position you trade in unless there were other underlying concerns. One thing is for sure, he has confirmed that from September he is, as he says, developing a new game in a new environment. There's no word on where he is exactly, although the likeliest options are either founding his own smaller studio or working with one of the limited number of major Japanese game firms. Square Enix have form in poaching talent like this, as the battle directors for both Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy XVI were both Capcom veterans, plus of course we've got the aforementioned case of Yuji Naka. Another possibility, of course, is a major player such as Tencent or another Chinese corporation. The Chinese giant Tencent has designs on being a big player in video games, quietly taking up big stakes in League of Legends publisher Riot Games, Fortnite's Epic Games, and that's just the start. Ubisoft, Platinum Games, Supercell, Paradox Interactive, Funcom, Sharknel, Discord, Fat Shark. The money is sloshing around big time from them, and it's not impossible to imagine them making some very big offers to disaffected talent. 2D Zelda's Kentaro Tominaga was a rare member of Nintendo's long-term team to up sticks in 2022 to join Chinese studio Paper Games to make an open-world title called Infinity Nikki. However, let's also look at some of the other recent resignations. There is Davide Soliani. I have covered his exit in a different video, but the Mario + Rabbids creator himself only commented that he was pursuing, quote, a new adventure. Although Ubisoft has long been hemorrhaging staff, with an Axios report in 2021 noting that dozens of people were turning away with concerns as diverse as low pay, a surfeit of competitive opportunities, creative frustration, and worry about the way a misconduct scandal in 2020 was handled. One person reportedly said, "There's something about management and creative scraping by with the bare minimum that really turned me away." Hideki Kamiya, who touts himself on his social media feeds as unemployed, also appears to have had concerns about the corporate environment in which he was working. He said around the time of his exit last year, "My work with Platinum Games was based on a relationship of trust with the company. I decided to leave because I felt that the direction the company was headed in was different from my beliefs as a developer. Without that element of trust, I couldn't continue working there, and so I left, so that I could continue working in what I consider to be the right way. I don't think of games as products, but rather as works of art. I want to put my artistry into games and deliver games that could only be made by Hideki Kamiya, so that players can enjoy Hideki Kamiya games exactly as they are. I decided to leave the company and forge my own path to continue making games that reflect the developers who made them." So, in the space of less than a year, we have 3 celebrity game directors in 3 studios turning their back on the major studios that in many cases their great work has helped to build or at least sustain over the past years. But the question here isn't so much what's happening to them, but where Nintendo fits into all this. In theory, it's unlikely to affect them too much at all. I don't think that many would assume that they will rush to bring these maverick talents in-house. By and large, Nintendo has focused on developing their own talent, and outside studios really have to push to even be heard. It took Mages a year to convince Nintendo to even show their internal team their pitches for Famicom Detective Club, and that's a tiny micro-budget franchise which has been dead for decades. Outsiders not well versed in the Nintendo way of doing things are an odd fit, and creatives who have chased against restrictions elsewhere would theoretically not enjoy the weather over at Nintendo HQ. Except I wonder. Nintendo is expanding and rapidly. It pushed back the opening of its new Kyoto headquarters by a year to accommodate even more developers, and that's only to be expected. They are about to enter the era of 4K gaming, which requires 4 times as much graphical detail as HD, and the scale of games is getting ever larger. Despite having barely a decade separating them, the difference in scale between Skyward Sword and Tears of the Kingdom is like comparing apples with the moon. they also have an impeccable record of supporting creators, even creators that were not originally from Nintendo. They appear to have gone a long way to support and protect Masahiro Sakurai, and while we don't know exactly what's happening with Smash, the fact that he seems to have gone back to work suggests that they have listened and acknowledged his concerns of somebody taking on the iconic franchise without his say-so and involvement. Nintendo are perfectly within their rights to milk Smash for every penny it's worth, even without Sakurai, because it's a huge franchise made up primarily of their IP, but they respect the creator. Several times they've given Yoshio Sakamoto latitude to follow projects that interest him, including most recently commissioning the Emio the Smiling Man continuation of the ultra-niche Famicom Detective Club series. Granted, it was external developers Mages that first pushed the Famicom Detective Club to return, but it still speaks well of the company that they offer the kind of creative support they do to their most senior creative visionaries. When Nintendo purchased Monolith Soft, they reached out to them and said, just go out there and make something that can't be found elsewhere in the industry. They formed an ownership deal where the core people still have a small percentage stake in the company, even though it is 96% owned by Nintendo. Surely a very lucrative prospect that keeps those key figures financially as well as creatively rewarded. It was Shinji Hatano, mastermind of several Nintendo partnerships, who met with Monolith Soft and delivered this message. Now, Hatano-san is now in his mid-80s and has left games except for being an outside director at Marvelous, but still, Nintendo has a track record of being good to game developers elsewhere. Hideki Kamiya himself explained how Bayonetta 2 was saved from the brink in a 2014 interview. As for Bayonetta, he said, we developed the game after signing a deal with Sega. Later it was decided to also develop the sequel, so we started working on Bayonetta 2. When development had progressed to a certain degree, in Sega's situation it turned into, this isn't a good plan, so development halted temporarily. Without funding, we didn't have the possibility to continue development, but we wanted to get this partially developed Bayonetta 2 available to the public one way or another. So, we offered it to various publishers, but as it is a big title, we couldn't find a partner company. Finally, Bayonetta 2 was about to get terminated completely when Nintendo came in and lent a hand, and we were able to restart the development we so desired. Then there are cases like Intelligent Systems. It would be simplicity itself for Nintendo to flex its muscles and absorb the company, but they have great relationships with them and are comfortable with them having operational independence while still developing key titles like Paper Mario, Fire Emblem, and WarioWare. Basically, Nintendo has a huge track record of treating developers very well indeed. There were tales of crunch on the first Metroid Prime, but reportedly Nintendo heard about this, came in, and sorted it out. Nintendo goes to extraordinary lengths to protect and cherish its creative minds, and especially its senior talent. That said, it is not a place generally for superstar creators. Sure, Sakamoto, Tanabe, and Tezuka, as well as even younger creators like Yosuke Kibuki and Fujibayashi-san, seem to have strong degrees of latitude in the games they create, although even then they're working as part of a big team. And even as recently as the announcement of Astral Chain, Nintendo made absolutely sure people knew the talent behind it, because there was an audience interest in this kind of thing. But at this point in time particularly, Nintendo is ever more cautious about putting its top talent in front of the public, and with the exception of their occasional developer interview segments on the website, they mostly shield their talent from the public as well. This suits the company for a few reasons. One, it is more valuable to have the perception of corporate output and corporate projection of quality, as otherwise, as here, the loss of a single individual could have negative consequences, something that Capcom may be finding out at the moment. Now, it's true that if Eiji Aonuma or Yoshiaki Koizumi or another senior named Nintendo executive of real tenure left, it would attract some interest, but Nintendo is broader than any one individual, even any one group. But you're never going to see Nintendo headlining a new title as a Hidemaru Fujibayashi title. These are team efforts, and they emphasize the team nature, even as they give voices to a few senior creatives. Secondly, while Nintendo employees are, from what we can tell, very well and competitively compensated, it is not in the company's interest to create a divisive atmosphere with big names trying to command outsized paychecks. the way that they seem to protect themselves from this kind of thing is by hiring outside teams. For example, Masahiro Sakurai's company Sora is by all accounts only run by him and his wife, with the actual day-to-day development working on the Super Smash Bros. Titles and other Sora projects run out of Bandai Namco. But this slight arm's distance from Nintendo gives him operational independence and gives Nintendo a bit of a wall between Sakurai and his other projects. If Sakurai-san says something in a YouTube video that they were skeptical about, well, he's not a Nintendo employee, although obviously they will want to continue good relations with him. And there's no doubt that the way an ownership deal like Monolith Soft was constructed would involve a very healthy remuneration for the company's senior people. Of course, the third issue, and perhaps the major one, is that Nintendo is not, and hasn't been for 2 decades now, a leader in the field technologically. If you want to create an absolutely cutting-edge title, at least from a graphical point of view, a Nintendo system is not where you would flock. Not historically, anyway. And yet I wonder if that might not be changing. For one thing, the next system will inevitably be closer to the industry-leading consoles in terms of power because it's new and is designed to last on the market for 10 years. Of course, the PlayStation 5 Pro and the forthcoming new Microsoft and Sony generations will make that distance yawn open once again, but for now, we're in a window where developing for Nintendo might not give you quite the flexibility of other machines, but it's not too bad either. But also, these developers are all now in a very different position than they were a year ago. When you're working for Capcom or Ubisoft and are able to command vast teams and big budgets, it makes perfect sense to assemble a AAA staff and to try to capture that end of the market. But if you're trying to go it alone and bootstrap yourself up, is the massive risk of a AAA venture really a logical starting point? Better surely to do something of a smaller scale with lower graphical expectations, but a focus on great gameplay. Plus, arguably, graphical and processing power is becoming less crucial over time in terms of distinguishing the consoles, because all the consoles already have a very high level of power. Nintendo may not offer the most powerful hardware, but they always know every compression trick in the book to make sure that they can make the best use out of it. So here is where I think Nintendo does potentially stand to benefit. Now, I don't expect to see many or any of the people who are leaving top developers elsewhere becoming in-house Nintendo developers. Nintendo has a particular way of doing things, and it's passed down through the company over a long period. Japanese workplaces have a strong emphasis on harmony and oneness, and Nintendo would not necessarily want any disruptive elements, even if they are incredibly talented creators in their own right. But would they be keen to commission games from new studios set up by any of these industry talents, and probably to put their finger on the scales to support development and distribution? I think the answer is definitely yes. As much as Nintendo likes to stand apart from the rest of the industry, they had veto power over Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. They could easily have looked with skepticism at the arrival of a number of third-party characters, especially from games like Persona 5 and Kingdom Hearts, which were not at that point available on the Nintendo Switch. But it seems that they themselves produced a wish list, and the fact that they aggressively moved into pushing third-party game characters for the Fighters Pass DLC, with 2/3 of each Fighters Pass comprising external characters of Nintendo, suggests that they were not just willing but keen to open their arms to the wider game industry. If, and it's a big if, but if, they can set themselves up as a beacon for disaffected talent who feel oppressed by corporate tomfoolery to the other companies, they could stand to win big. Nintendo seeks to put a smile on people's faces, but I think this also includes the creative forces behind so many great games of our time. As Shigeru Miyamoto told Game Informer in 2017, the philosophy of Nintendo has always been to be unique, to be different, and we're not trying to compete with the current trend or the current fad. So what I do try to tell younger developers is to really think seriously about making what it is you want to make. Of course, some of these iconic creators on the market have certainly thought long and hard about the kind of games they want to make, and there's a decent chance that they still have unique and creative ideas to offer. Even if the specifics of the games Hideki Kamiya wants to make are not necessarily classic Nintendo titles, the philosophy seems, amazingly, well in line with what Nintendo are trying to do. Now, Nintendo, as I've said, has always been quite insular and even dismissive of the work of the rest of the industry, but that's not to say they can't harvest connections if and when they wish. The industry in Japan is still small enough that everybody is going to know someone who knows someone. Nintendo often works by developing relationships. Look how cautious and skeptical they were with mages approaching the company with a Famicom Detective Club pitch, or Ubisoft pitching Mario + Rabbids. They also naturally put a premium on their existing franchises, but that's not to say that they are averse to something new. They already specifically confirmed back in March to investors that they are working on a new IP, and it stands to reason that not all of their new IP will be of the smaller scale of Sushi Strikers or The Stretchers. They will at some point have another Astral Chain, or ARMS or Splatoon, original games of some substance, and yet these titles do need a bit more of a push than your standard Mario, Zelda, Animal Crossing type titles. With ARMS, they did put Kosuke Ibuki up front to demo it and contextualize it with the credibility of it being from the Mario Kart team, while with Astral Chain, they emphasized Platinum's involvement and the initial trailer listed those key creative forces. Granted, Nintendo seems to have changed considerably even over the last few years, as now they are keeping Sturm even over the developer of Mario & Luigi Brothership, which is incredibly close to release, but then again it depends on whether their partners are interested in making great games or in being famous. I suspect many developers are probably only too happy to have the veil of anonymity Nintendo provides, which has to insulate them from criticisms and fan demands, especially if they need to delay or make changes. Nintendo just absorbs the flack for any delays or any controversies as a company. The individuals are not targeted. There are rumours that a Bandai Namco team was behind the version of Metroid Prime 4 that was announced in 2019 as being scrapped, but nobody had to lose face because Nintendo took the hit and they never even confirmed who was working on that title. And we know from a recent Kit and Krista episode that Nintendo do often, quite quietly, support the development of indie titles, often barely mentioning to their own team, so the newly muscular post-Switch Nintendo would have the capacity to put its weight behind some original titles of slightly greater scale, perhaps from some known creatives starting out afresh. Now, let's talk likelihoods. The industry in Japan, let alone the world, is obviously far bigger than Nintendo, and Nintendo is famously cautious. The balance of probability has to be that these people do not end up working with, for, or in any form of relationship alongside Nintendo. But there is a route for Nintendo, if they choose to take it, of being a champion of creative freedom and developer independence. They have the size and the resources, and it massively fits their brand. But mainly, they also just have the strength of character to do something a little bit offbeat. Currently, the publisher and developer relationship team is led by Satoru Shibata, for a long time the head of Nintendo Europe and also a former outside director of the Pokemon Company. In 2018 he joined the board of directors of the company, but his eye these days seems to be more on marketing and company management, so I suspect it will be for more junior members of staff to do the vital outreach work and nurture these kinds of relationships. Ultimately, I think it is unlikely that Nintendo will be the best fit for many of these people, although of course in the case of Hideki Kamiya, there is a pre-existing relationship because of Bayonetta, and the same for Davide Soliani, who is demonstrably not just a genius game developer, but also a huge Nintendo fanboy. Of course, one highly unlikely left-field possibility worth mentioning, and I do emphasise highly unlikely, Hideaki Itsuno has an incredibly deep knowledge of fighting games going back to his time working on the iconic Dreamcast 3D fighter Power Stone. If Masahiro Sakurai really did want to move on from full-time shepherding of the Super Smash Bros. Titles, perhaps Itsuno-san could inherit the mantle and reimagine the franchise for the post-Sakurai era, hopefully with Masahiro Sakurai still having some kind of overall involvement. I think this is incredibly unlikely, as there's no indication he has a particular interest in that direction, and it's not wholly clear how Sakurai-san would feel about being replaced, even with his blessing and involvement. But this kind of bold leap to a superstar creative might be the only way for Nintendo to manage transition to a post-Sakurai era when it finally does come, without the risk of it seeming like an anticlimax. Sakurai is such a huge name that replacing him with another huge name would at least afford the new title the right to be heard without fears that it's going to be an inferior version. Still, with Nintendo expanding, they will also want to ensure that younger developers within their studios are retained and promoted and given opportunities to become the new superstar creators of the future. We've seen some of this with Kenta Motakura taking on the 3D Mario reins when he was still in his 20s, the still relatively young Kosuke Ibuki heading Mario Kart and ARMS, and even opportunities for long-standing staff members to push themselves into more senior creative roles, such as when we saw Shiromori taking on the director's chair of Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and Kaori Miyachi stepping up to work alongside Yoshia Sakamoto on Famicom Detective Club. In this way, Nintendo may be less focused on acquiring new talent from outside their studios, but focused on retaining and developing their talent from within. That has certainly been the approach that has served them well up until now. Of course, if you want more on the specifics of some of their internal studios, do check out this video on Kosuke Ibuki's Entertainment and Production Group 9, who are responsible for ARMS, Nintendogs and Mario Kart. Thank you very much for watching, thanks especially to my Patreon supporters, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast video.